Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get the latest on the Israel-Hamas war, and for that we turn to Dr. Alon Burstein. Alon, as always, good to see you. Let's get straight into the news here. So this continues to be the story of the week. Students at a growing number of U.S. colleges are gathering in protest encampments with a unified demand of their schools. Basically, stop doing business with Israel or any companies that support its ongoing war in Gaza. It's been inspired by ongoing protests and the arrests last week of more than 100 students at Columbia University specifically. We've also seen students from Massachusetts to California who are gathering by the hundreds on their campuses, setting up tent camps and pledging to stay put until their demands are met. From what you're reading, Alon, from your perspective, is all of this protest activity here stateside making any sort of stir in the Middle East at this point?
So it's creating a lot of wind in the sails of different protests and protest movements in the Middle East. It has a lot of effect on grassroots level organizations. In Jordan, we've seen a lot of protests, and the fact that they all of a sudden see people protesting in the United States, students with the same messages, with the same flags, with the same banners, obviously gives a lot of wind in to their sails. We see the same thing in student bodies that are protesting across the West Bank. They're part of this growing international movement protesting the war. So in that sense, it does make a lot of news. It is not going to be something, or is unlikely to be something, that ends up affecting the way the Israeli government does actually develop the war, right? These protests are not going to have anywhere enough strength to mount that kind of pressure on the Israeli government. The only place that they could end up, though, having some impact, and it could end up being an important impact, is if they persist, and, as the movement leaders state that they intend to persist and intend to expand and escalate, then they could end up mounting pressure on their different U.S. representatives, Congress people, senators. They, in turn, could apply pressure on the Biden administration. Now, again, realistically, is the Biden administration going to, in an election year, turn its back on Israel and completely reverse its policy as a result of these protests? On the one hand, unlikely. On the other hand, we are seeing that there is growing movement within, specifically the Democratic Party, that is applying pressure on the U.S. administration to at least throw its weight towards influencing Israel. If not stopping the war, then influencing Israel, restraining Israel. We saw this again after what happened with the incident with the World Central Kitchen aid workers that were killed by an Israeli drone on April 1st. All of a sudden, the Biden administration managed to exert enough pressure on Israel that we've change in terms of the entrance of humanitarian aid and the entrance of all kinds of things into the Gaza Strip, the establishment of the maritime corridor. All this we're seeing as a result of U.S. pressure. So it is possible that these protesters can hope that they will manage to achieve enough pressure to their Congress people and in turn apply pressure on the Biden administration. But that is really all they can hope for. It's very unlikely that we'll see the developments that this will impact the way governments operate in the Middle East, at least at this point.
Protests continue around the U.S. tonight. Let's move on. Hamas released, and let's pull up this video in full screen because we want to look at it in full. So Hamas released a hostage video on Wednesday showing a well-known Israeli-American man who was abducted from the now infamous Nova Music Festival on October 7th. This is Hirsch Goldberg Poland, and he's been in captivity for about 200 days. This is a still image from the hostage video. We're not going to show the full thing. He was clearly speaking under duress. He's also missing part of his left arm, but this is the first sign of life we've seen from him since October 7th alone. It's worth saying, however, that no one can confirm when the video was recorded. I'm curious, how is Israel and its citizens reacting to the release of a hostage video?
So I'll say a couple of things about the hostage video and specifically this hostage Hirsch. First of all, he was seen on October 7th in videos that were published from the kidnapping where his arm was already blown off. So we saw that actually happened during the attack of October 7th. Secondly, in the video, Hirsch also says that he is coming close to 200 days in captivity. And he discusses at length at the end of the video wishing his family a happy Passover to the extent that they can have, saying that he wishes he could celebrate with them. And we're currently at the beginning of the week of the Jewish holiday of Passover. So this obviously is not definitive confirmation, right? This video could have been shot a while ago and he was told to say that and released now. But it is, I would argue, more likely that it was shot in the last week or so. Just if I go by the historical patterns of the way Hamas does film these videos, usually they don't plan them that much in advance in terms of like deciding what day they're going to release it and what not. So I would estimate that it was probably filmed in the last week. Obviously, again, I'm saying that as an academic, not as an intelligence analyst person. That's in terms of like when it was aired, or sorry, when it was filmed. Now, in terms of the reactions in Israel, the reactions of the family members of hostages and the people who are out protesting by the thousands for a hostage deal was severe. In response to the release of this video, there were spontaneous outbursts of protests within Israel. Some of these got more violent with actually, torching fires and things like that on highways, all calling upon the government to basically come to some sort of decision about how it's going to release the hostages. Because what is happening right now is the hostage deal is completely frozen. Hamas has not changed its position for the last, I would say, at least month or 6 weeks of negotiations when negotiations were still ongoing. Hamas said that it is sticking to its position that it requires complete IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and an ultimate ceasefire in the last stages of the deal, but they have to be agreed upon in the first stages of the deal. Israel has said that's a non-starter. And so despite ongoing negotiations and even a summit that occurred in Cairo 2 weeks ago, nothing has actually happened. The family members are saying that Israel needs to stop waiting for Hamas to be the one to say, okay, here's what we're willing to offer. And instead, Israel needs to offer its own deal. It needs to offer its own terms. It needs to offer its ways to retrieve the hostages. The family members are also protesting the fact that in Israel, there is growing sentiment that there's going to be an invasion of Rafah. There's more and more indications of that. Maybe we'll talk about that later. That there's going to be an invasion of Rafah, and the Israeli government is saying that this is going to increase the pressure on Hamas in order to reach a hostage deal, which, military experts in Israel are saying that could happen. At the same time, the family members are saying maybe that's true, but in fact, only 3 hostages thus far have been rescued alive as a result of IDF activity. All the rest of the hostages that have been returned alive were returned in a deal, and also we know for a fact that at least 3 to 5 or 6 different hostages were also killed as a result of IDF activity. So the family members of hostages see this video, they say there's a life sign, we know that he's alive. Applying more military pressure right now is not something that they want to support. They want to support Israel coming to a different outcome, bring the hostages back first, and only then going forth with the war.
I want to talk a little more about Gaza. So this is some video we saw this week from the Israeli Air Force. Israeli warplanes pounded the northern Gaza Strip for a second day on Wednesday in a fierce assault that has broken weeks of comparative calm. The IAF posting this, I believe, yesterday. I want to ask you about Rafah further down south in a minute. But first, let's discuss the rest of the Strip. What do we know about what's been targeted in Gaza this week so far, Alon?
So we saw on Monday, I believe, starting Sunday, we saw more on Monday, barrages of rockets that were fired from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, specifically the Al-Quds brigades of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, took responsibility for these rockets. And they said that they're doing that in defiance of the IDF, to show that 200 days into the war, it was 200 days, we're marking the 200 days of the war yesterday. At 200 days into the war, we're still able to fire rockets from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, from where the IDF says it has operational control since December. Well, look, we can still fire rockets. What we're seeing really now is the IDF retaliation to that. We're seeing, and the same thing continued on Wednesday. We saw more rockets that were fired towards the areas of Sderot, Nivim, Nir Am, Kisufim in Israel, and in turn, the IDF carrying out these, as you said, like massive bombardments that are really died down in the Gaza Strip and the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in the last several weeks. As far as we know, what the IDF is targeting is primarily different launching sites. In order to fire rockets, you don't have to actually have someone on the scene. You can set up the rocket launching sites, months in advance, and then just, input a code, pull a trigger, depending on the type of rocket that you're firing. So the IDF is targeting a lot of these launching sites themselves. In addition to that, the IDF is also targeting different, what they call terrorism infrastructure. That could be anything from different weapons warehouses. Terrorism infrastructure can also be an apartment building in which the different organizations, either Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have one of their headquarters, right? That also then becomes, the code name is terrorism infrastructure. So mostly what we're seeing in these pictures, what it says down below in Hebrew there in the messages of the IDF is attacking terror infrastructure. So that means, again, not necessarily launching sites, but really what this is the IDF retaliating a display of force. after the Palestinian Islamic Jihad showed that it still has activity in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, the IDF is now showing in return, well, we're not afraid to return to substantial bombings in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip as needed. The IDF has also announced that it is going to carry out a major operation in the areas of Beit Lahia. This is one of the neighborhoods in Gaza City. In response to these rocket launchers, the IDF had announced to the civilians in Beit Lahia who are still there to immediately begin evacuation, saying a major operation is coming. So all this is the IDF sort of showing back, you're going to do display of force, we'll do display of force in the northern parts of the Strip.
And so let's talk a little more about Rafah. So the IDF has conducted all necessary, and I'm going to read a little bit of reporting from Reuters right now alone. So the IDF has conducted all necessary preparations to take Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah, and they can launch an operation the moment it gets government approval, according to a senior Israeli defense official who spoke with Reuters on Wednesday. We've talked about this looming invasion for so long alone. Let's remind the audience, what exactly is the IDF's objective in Rafah?
So Rafah is the most southern city in the Gaza Strip. It is actually a city that is divided in two. The border between Gaza and Egypt cuts Rafah in half. I mean, this goes back to many years ago. By now, it's two separate cities. But that's just to say that it's right adjacent to the most southern border of the Gaza Strip, and that's where the Rafah crossing is. Since the war began, the IDF, already dating back to October, called upon Palestinian civilians to evacuate from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip to the south, and the south meant the Al-Muasi region above Rafah and the Rafah area. Then when the IDF invaded Khan Yunis, it also called upon civilians to evacuate towards the Al-Muasi area. So right now, condensed into Rafah, there are estimated between 1.4 and 1.6 million Palestinian people, a lot of them internally displaced. The entire population of the Gaza Strip is roughly 2.2, 2.3 million before the war. And they are all within Rafah and the adjacent refugee camps, primarily Al-Muasi refugee camps. Alongside that, Hamas has battalions that are stationed in different cities. Hamas built itself over the last 15, 16 years as an army, and we saw this. We saw this in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Hamas had divisions that were in charge of different areas. There's battalions of Saja'iyah, the battalions of Jabalia, battalions of Zaytun, each one trained differently, each one having its own missions. In Khan Yunis, Hamas had 4 different battalions. They were responsible, some of them for rocket launching, some of them were responsible for security, and they were very, very strong. Similarly, in Rafah, Hamas still maintains 4 battalions. A battalion is a fighting unit. It's one of the ways that a terror organization like Hamas transforms itself a little bit into being an army rather than just having, sort of activists out, operatives that carry out random violent attacks, quote unquote. It develops a much more regimented organization in which there are officers, there are intelligence units, there are people who are in charge of logistics, there are people who are in charge of supplies, medical supplies, communications. All these things are things that Hamas has been building and modeling after the way Hezbollah built it over the years. And this is really what let them carry out such an effective attack on October 7th, right? That's exactly what we saw. It was not a bunch of, terrorists who are just trained to go fight without any organization, go fight and kill. It was a very, very well-oiled machine. In Rafah, there are 4 battalions that Hamas has. And really what Israel is stating, and we see this backed up by history also, that should the war end now and Israel just pull back, Hamas will rebuild. These battalions are strong enough, they're powerful enough, even though Hamas has lost roughly 18 or 19 battalions out of its 24, 25. With these, it can still retake Gaza. It will still be the only governing body in Gaza. So as far as Israel is concerned, it is saying we need to invade Rafah in order to uproot the last stronghold of Hamas, because after that, they will not be able to rebuild. I will add that there's also a central city in the Gaza Strip, Deir el-Balah, that also has not been invaded by the IDF. The IDF is also starting to set its sights on that, and either in parallel to Rafah or before or after, the IDF is also going to want to invade there. Alongside this is also obviously the issue of the hostages. Where are they being held? According to a lot of estimates, a lot of them are in Rafah, since the IDF has a lot of presence throughout the Gaza Strip, hasn't found them. So that's also one of the missions, obviously, but that's not the main aspiration of the invasion of Rafah, because again, that could be achieved by other means. The main aspiration is the dismantling of the this infrastructure of these battalions.
And those battalions are something that we've been talking about for quite some time. I just want to hit on the humanitarian angle to this as well, because international allies, including the U.S., have been watching the humanitarian situation in Rafah closely. Does it feel like it's safe to say that we won't see an Israeli ground invasion until something is done on the humanitarian front?
Well, that has been a pledge that Israel gave to the United States, and it is something that realistically Israel would need to do. First of all, Israel, as is under so much international scrutiny and specifically pressuring the United States to improve the humanitarian situation, to not have another situation where you have scores of Palestinian civilians that are dying as a result of an IDF operation. So Israel needs, in order to have the U.S. backing, which it needs, diplomatically at least, and also materially, in order to carry out this invasion, Israel needs to satisfy the United States. And that is one reason that we can be very assured that Israel is going to first order the evacuation of civilians from Rafah. The process is due to take, according to different estimates, between 2 to 3 weeks. And then we will see a mass exodus of civilians to different areas. There has already been, yesterday, 2 days ago, I believe, AP published satellite images showing that tent cities are being erected in the areas around Khan Yunis in anticipation of creating these, what we talked about before, these humanitarian bubbles. That's one reason that the IDF has and will need to do that. Another reason is also an operational interest. The IDF plans on pouring massive amounts of forces into Rafah. Right now, if you see pictures that emerge from Rafah, there are areas where there are tents just sprawled across the streets. Because once again, a town that used to have 200 to 300,000 people is all of a sudden housing 1 million people, and a refugee camp in the northern parts of the town, El Mouassi, which previously had several dozen thousand people. I don't have the exact figures, but I'm going to say 50 to 60,000. All of a sudden is housing 500,000 people. The IDF, in order to carry out an effective operation here, is going to literally need the space. It cannot mobilize tank units down the street if there are civilians with tents in the middle. So it's both a need to satisfy the humanitarian situation in order to answer to international pressure. It is also a very big operational need of the IDF. You cannot carry out an effective invasion, ground forces with an army, in an area that is tiny and has 1 million civilians that are densed into a city. You're not going to be able to carry out your operation in any measure of success. So due to those two reasons, we are for sure going to see first the IDF beginning the evacuation. It is estimated to take 2 to 3 weeks. And then, according to different leaks, the operation the IDF has planned in Rafah is expected to take about 6 weeks. But again, that's what's planned, not necessarily what will happen.
And of course, Alon, I think one major question that you and I are going to be looking forward to getting answered is how exactly are they going to separate the humanitarian situation, the civilians, from the terrorists when they do move these civilians to the humanitarian islands? We got to leave it there for now, Alon. Thank you for your analysis as always, and we always look forward to your daily YouTube uploads as well. Take care.